Welcome to the Practical World Podcast, your gateway to work insights and captivating stories from Thailand and beyond. This is the real world. This is the Practical World Podcast.
All right, let's dive into something I think we can all relate to studying.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to be dissecting a YouTube video today called How I Study Smarter, Not Harder from the channel Respire.
Okay.
And this video breaks down the science-backed study habits of some seriously impressive learners.
Cool.
Yeah, so let's be real for a second. Most of us probably didn't get like a master class in effective studying back in school, right?
Right.
So this is our chance to upgrade our game.
Yeah, absolutely. Effective studying is not something that is explicitly taught.
Exactly.
It's just something we're kind of expected to pick up along the way.
Yeah, and I think that's why this video is so interesting, because they actually did research on almost 700 medical students
Oh, wow.
to figure out what set apart the most effective learners.
Medical students.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a great cohort to study because the stakes are so high for them to learn and retain information.
for sure.
So what did the researchers find out about these high achievers?
Well, the top habit that jumped out was shockingly simple.
Mm.
They scheduled dedicated study time.
Okay.
I know it sounds basic.
Yeah, it's easy to dismiss the simple things.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear why scheduling is so impactful.
So the video explains
Mm.
it's not just about like finding the time in your schedule, right? It's about sending a really powerful signal to your brain.
Oh,
When you consistently carve out those study blocks, you're essentially telling your brain, okay, it's focus time.
yeah.
You know,
Interesting.
like this is when we do this thing.
So it's about training your brain to anticipate and prioritize learning
Yes.
during those specific windows.
Yeah.
It's like creating a mental groove
Yes.
for focused attention.
And the research backs it up, they say. When you stick to a regular study schedule,
Wow.
your brain actually becomes more efficient at concentrating during those times.
That's incredible.
It's wild.
Yeah.
It's like building a mental muscle for focus.
Right.
You know,
Train your brain.
but they didn't stop there. These super learners,
Yep.
they took things a step further
Mhm.
by creating a distraction-free environment.
Distraction free.
Yeah.
That's a tall order these days,
Yeah.
especially for anyone trying to juggle
Oh, yeah.
work, family, and let's be honest, the constant lure of our phones.
Right. But these future doctors, they knew what was up. They made it a point to study alone phones, banished, no interruptions,
Wow.
full hermit mode.
Full hermit mode. I love it.
And the video highlighted that this is because multitasking, which is like this myth we all try to live by, you
Right.
know,
I think we can do it.
yes,
Yeah.
is actually a brain killer.
Multitasking is a myth.
Yeah,
Our brains are not designed for it.
like truly.
Yeah. What we call multitasking is actually our brains rapidly switching between tasks.
Yes.
And that comes at a cost.
yes.
There's a cognitive delay
Yes.
every time we shift focus, and that can really disrupt our flow state,
Yes.
especially when we're trying to learn something new.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. The video dives into a technique that honestly like blew me away called active recall.
Active recall.
Have you heard of this?
I have. It's a powerful one.
Yeah.
It's about actively engaging with the material
Right.
instead of passively absorbing it.
The video describes a fascinating experiment
Okay.
with kids who read a biography,
Okay.
and one group reread it multiple times like classic study tactics.
Yeah.
The other group, they tested themselves on the material.
Interesting.
You're not going to believe who remembered more.
I have a feeling it's the group who tested themselves.
Yeah.
Rereading can create an illusion of fluency,
Oh my gosh.
where the material feels familiar, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's encoded in our long-term memory.
Yes. The kids who actively tested themselves on the material
Yeah.
absolutely crushed it.
Wow.
So it turns out that testing ourselves isn't just about like assessing what we know.
Right.
It's a powerful learning tool in its own right.
It's like the difference between looking at a map and actually navigating a city.
I love that.
You might recognize landmarks,
Right.
but until you've walked the streets,
Well-
you don't truly understand the layout.
And here's the kicker. The students who tested themselves were actually less confident about their knowledge.
Interesting. I would think the act of testing would boost confidence.
I know.
So why were they less confident?
But they actually performed better on the final exam than those who just reread.
So testing reveals what we truly know
Yes.
and helps us overcome that fluency illusion.
Right.
It helps us to differentiate between familiarity and mastery.
Exactly. It helps pinpoint those knowledge gaps we didn't even realize we had.
Right.
Now, if you think testing yourself is hardcore,
Oh, yeah.
wait till you hear what these med students did next.
Okay.
They taught the material to their peers.
Oh.
Like, whoa.
Teaching, that takes active recall to a whole new level.
Right.
You have to organize the information,
Yeah.
clarify the concepts, and anticipate questions.
Yeah.
That requires deep understanding.
I imagine that process of explaining a concept to someone else can be quite revealing.
Absolutely.
You might discover gaps in your own understanding
Right.
or encounter questions that you hadn't even thought of.
It's a powerful way to identify your blind spots
Yes.
and deepen your understanding.
Think about it. To teach someone something, you have to be able to break it down into its core components
Yeah.
and explain it clearly and concisely.
It's like you have to become fluent
Yes.
in the language of that subject.
Yes. And as we all know, the best way to learn a language is to immerse yourself in it and actually use it.
Exactly.
So they're really onto something.
Yeah, they are.
The video also touched on something called the gap effect, which is the importance of taking those like mini breaks
Yeah.
during a study session.
I love the gap effect. Have you heard of this?
I have.
Oh.
It's fascinating.
It's amazing how our brains work even when we think we're giving them a break.
So it turns out those short pauses aren't just about like resting your weary eyes, right?
Yeah.
They actually allow your hippocampus, which is that part of your brain that's responsible for forming new memories,
Yeah.
to process and consolidate information.
It's like hitting the save button.
What on
We're
your
learning.
Okay.
Those short breaks give the hippocampus a chance to replay what you've just learned,
That's wild.
but at a much faster speed than during your actual study time.
Wait, so you're telling me that spacing out
Yeah,
during my study session could actually help me learn better?
a little bit. Yeah.
That almost feels like cheating.
Think of it as working smarter, not harder.
Okay. I like that.
Yeah, and speaking of working smarter,
Oh,
there's another crucial factor highlighted in the video
right.
that we can't overlook,
Hmm.
and that's motivation.
Ah, yes, the fuel that keeps us going.
Yes, you can have all the best techniques in the world,
Right.
but without motivation,
It's
it's hard to make any real progress.
Yeah. And the video reveals something really interesting about these high achieving med students.
Hmm,
They had a strong sense of purpose, driving your studies.
interesting.
Like it wasn't just about
Yeah,
getting good grades or, whatever.
not just about checking boxes.
Yeah, it was about something bigger.
It makes sense when you have a clear why
Right.
behind your efforts. Those late night study sessions and challenging concepts suddenly feel more meaningful.
They do.
Yeah.
It's like they had a vision of where they were headed and why it mattered to them.
And it doesn't need to be this grand
Yeah.
life altering purpose.
Right.
It can be something much simpler.
Like what?
It could be the desire to improve your skills in a particular area,
Oh.
the satisfaction of mastering a challenging concept,
Hmm.
or even just the simple joy of learning something new.
Okay.
Sometimes it's about finding ways to make the material personally relevant
Yes.
or connecting it to your broader goals and interests.
I like that, finding those personal connections to the material. Like,
Yeah.
why does this matter to me?
Right. What's the point?
What am I going to use this for?
Yeah.
You know.
How does it connect to my life?
That's really cool.
Yeah,
So we've uncovered some pretty incredible insights
we have.
about how to study smarter, not harder.
Yeah.
And I'm already feeling inspired to up my study game,
Me too.
but we've only just scratched the surface.
Right. We've got more to dive into.
There's so much more to explore.
Yeah.
So in part 2,
Yeah.
we'll delve even deeper into the science behind these effective learning strategies
Oh,
and explore some practical tips
awesome.
for putting them into action.
Can't wait.
Stay tuned.
Okay.
Welcome back, everyone.
It's great to be back.
It's amazing how much we're uncovering
I know, right?
about the science of learning.
It is remarkable how much we're learning about the inner workings of our own minds.
It feels like we're finally getting a glimpse behind the curtain
Yes.
and seeing how our brains actually tick.
Especially when it comes to learning and memory.
Yeah,
It's empowering to know we can optimize our study habits based on this knowledge.
exactly.
Nah.
We don't have to rely on these like outdated methods
Right.
or feel like we're just bad at studying.
Absolutely.
There are proven techniques
Yes.
that can make a world of difference.
For sure.
Speaking of which, let's revisit that game-changing technique we talked about earlier, active recall.
Yes, active recall is a powerful tool for moving information from our short term memory to our long term memory.
Okay.
It's based on the idea that the act of retrieving information from memory strengthens the neural connections
Hmm.
associated with that information.
It's like strengthening a muscle. The
Exactly.
more you use it,
Yeah, the more you use it, the stronger it gets.
the stronger it gets. Yeah, so I know we discussed the experiment with the kids and the biography, but can you elaborate a little bit more on like how active recall works on a neurological level?
Certainly. So imagine your brain as a vast network of interconnected pathways.
Okay.
Every time you learn something new, you're essentially forging a new pathway through this network. But if you don't revisit that pathway, it can become overgrown and difficult to access.
So active recall is like sending a crew out there to like clear the path and make it more accessible.
Precisely when you actively try to retrieve information from memory,
Yeah.
you're reactivating that pathway,
Okay.
making it stronger and easier to access in the future.
Okay. That makes sense.
This is why simply rereading material can be deceptive.
Hmm.
It might feel familiar,
Right.
but that familiarity doesn't necessarily mean you've encoded the information deeply enough for long term retention.
Okay. That explains why I used to spend hours like highlighting textbooks
Right?
and
Yeah.
feeling like I was making progress,
The illusion of progress.
only to completely blank on the exam.
Highlighting can give us a false sense of mastery.
Yeah.
It's like taking a picture of a landmark. It
Right.
doesn't mean you know how to get there yourself.
Yeah.
With active recall, you're not just passively observing the information,
Right.
you're actively engaging with it, challenging your brain to retrieve it from memory.
And the more we challenge ourselves, the stronger those neural pathways become.
Exactly.
Which brings us back to those incredible med students
Yes.
who took active recall to the next level by teaching the material to their peers.
Teaching is a phenomenal way to solidify learning.
Oh, yeah.
Not only does it force you to recall and organize the information,
Yeah.
but it also requires you to communicate it effectively to others.
And I imagine that process of like explaining a concept to someone else can be quite revealing.
Absolutely.
You might discover gaps in your own understanding.
Right. You might even stumble upon gaps in your own understanding.
Right. Or encounter questions that you hadn't even thought of.
It's a learning opportunity for both the teacher and the student,
Yeah. It's a win win for everyone involved.
for sure.
Speaking of wins, I'm really intrigued by this idea of the gap effect.
The gap effect.
It feels almost too good to be true that taking short breaks during a study session can actually boost our learning.
It's counterintuitive, but research suggests that these short pauses can be incredibly beneficial. Remember how we talked about the hippocampus being responsible for memory formation?
Yes.
Well, during these breaks, the hippocampus gets busy consolidating information,
Hmm.
essentially transferring it from our short term memory to our long term memory.
So it's like those mini breaks are giving our brains a chance to catch up and like process
Yeah,
what we've just learned.
exactly. It's not just about giving our conscious minds a break, it's about giving our hippocampus
Uh,
a chance to do its work behind the scenes.
And those little distractions can really disrupt that process.
Right.
Like, think about it. When you're constantly bombarded with notifications,
Mhm.
your attention is fragmented
Yes.
and you're never fully present in the moment, whether you're studying
Right.
or even trying to relax.
It's like our brains are being pulled in a million different directions.
It's exhausting.
And it's exhausting.
And speaking of feeling overwhelmed, the video also highlighted another effective technique that can help us manage like large amounts of information.
Mm.
Spaced repetition.
Spaced repetition is a fantastic technique, especially when you have a lot of material to cover.
Yeah,
It's based on the principle that we tend to forget information over time,
right.
but we can counteract that forgetting by strategically reviewing information at increasing intervals.
So instead of cramming everything in one go,
Right.
we're strategically spacing out our review sessions.
Exact.
So it feels less overwhelming.
Imagine you're trying to learn a new language.
Okay.
If you try to memorize 100 new words in a single day, chances are you'll forget most of them by the next day.
Probably.
But if you spread out your learning, reviewing those words at increasing intervals,
Right.
you're much more likely to retain them in the long term.
It's like building a solid foundation brick by brick rather than trying to construct the entire building in a single day.
Exactly.
But how do we determine the optimal spacing for those review sessions?
That's where things get a bit more nuanced.
Okay.
The ideal spacing will vary depending on the type of information,
Right.
your prior knowledge, and your learning style.
Okay.
However, there are some general guidelines that can help you get started.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give me the insider tips.
One common approach is to review the material shortly after you first learn it,
Okay.
then again a day later,
Mm,
then a week later, and so on.
okay,
The key is to gradually increase the time between reviews
got it.
as you become more familiar with the material.
I can see how that would make sense as you become more confident.
Right.
You wouldn't need to review it as frequently.
Exactly.
But what if you're like really struggling with a particular concept?
Right.
Would you need to adjust the spacing?
Absolutely. If you find yourself constantly forgetting a specific piece of information, you might need to review it more frequently
Okay.
until it becomes more firmly embedded in your memory.
So it's like personalizing the workout plan for your brain.
That's a great way to put it.
I love how these techniques are all about working with our brains
Right.
rather than against them.
It's about understanding how our brains work
We're finally starting to understand the power of our own minds.
and then using that knowledge to our advantage.
Yeah, it's exciting to think about all the possibilities.
Absolutely.
But before we get too carried away, let's bring it back to that crucial ingredient we touched on earlier,
Yeah.
motivation.
Ah, yes, motivation is the fuel that propels us forward.
Yeah,
It's what keeps us going when the going gets tough.
for sure. And as we discussed earlier, those high achieving medical students had a strong sense of purpose
Yes, they did.
driving their studies.
It was like they had a clear vision of where they were headed
Right.
and why it mattered to them.
That inner drive can make all the difference.
You can.
But what about those of us who haven't quite figured out our life's calling?
Yeah.
How do we find that motivation when we're studying subjects that don't necessarily light us up? You know?
That's a great question. And it's something that many people struggle with.
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that motivation doesn't have to be this grand,
Right.
all consuming passion.
Yeah.
It can be something much simpler.
Like what?
It could be the desire to improve your skills in a particular area,
Okay.
the satisfaction of mastering a challenging concept,
Mm.
or even just the simple joy of learning something new.
Okay.
Sometimes it's about finding ways to make the material personally relevant
Right.
or connecting it to your broader goals and interests.
Yeah. I like that idea of finding those personal connections.
Yeah.
It's like finding the hidden treasure
Yeah.
in a subject that might initially seem dry or uninteresting.
Exactly.
But even when we find those sparks of motivation,
Yeah.
we all have those days when it's hard to get going.
Oh, absolutely.
What advice do you have for overcoming those moments of inertia?
That's where those small wins can be incredibly powerful.
Mm,
Instead of focusing on the enormity of the task ahead,
yeah.
try breaking it down into smaller, more manageable chunks.
So instead of thinking I have to study this entire textbook, I could
Mhm.
reframe it as I'm going to focus on this one chapter today.
Exactly.
Okay.
And as you complete each small task, you get a little boost of dopamine,
Okay.
that feel good neurotransmitter that reinforces positive behaviors.
Mm.
Those small wins can add up to big progress over time.
It's like training a dog with treats.
There you go.
You reward the small steps along the way, and eventually you have a well-trained pup.
That's a great analogy.
And consistency is key.
Consistency is key.
Even if you can only spare a few minutes each day,
Yeah,
those short bursts of effort can make a big difference in the long run.
absolutely. Little by little, a little becomes a lot.
I'm starting to feel a surge of motivation just thinking about all these strategies.
That's the spirit.
Yeah.
We're all capable of becoming more effective learners.
Hmm.
It's about understanding how our brains work and then using that knowledge to our advantage.
This has been such an insightful conversation. We've covered so much ground,
We have.
from active recall and spaced repetition
Right.
to the power of motivation,
So much good stuff.
and even the surprising benefits of short breaks. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling energized
I am too.
and ready to put these techniques into practice.
Me too. Let's do it.
But before we wrap up, I'm curious to know what other insights the video had to offer.
Yeah.
What else is in store for us in part 3? Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been on quite the journey exploring the science of smarter studying. And I have to say, my brain is feeling like it just got a major upgrade.
It's amazing how much our perspective can shift when we start to understand the inner workings of our own minds.
Absolutely. It's like we've been given this secret decoder ring for unlocking our learning potential.
Yeah.
And it's not about some magical shortcut or anything. It's about understanding the science
Right.
behind how we learn
Right.
and using those insights to our advantage.
I love that.
So we've talked about some incredibly powerful techniques, active recall,
Yeah.
space repetition, the gap effect.
Amazing stuff.
but I'm eager to hear what other gems this video had in store for us.
Well, one point that really resonated with me was the importance of metacognition, which is essentially the ability to think about our own thinking.
Metacognition.
Metacognition.
That sounds pretty deep.
It is. It's about,
Break it down for me. What does that actually mean?
yeah. So think of it as becoming aware of your own learning process.
Okay.
So it's about paying attention to how you learn best, what strategies work for you,
Okay.
and where you tend to struggle.
So it's about becoming like the CEO of your own learning journey.
Exactly. It's about taking ownership of your learning.
So instead of just like blindly applying techniques,
Right.
we're encouraged to become more mindful of our own process
Yeah.
and make adjustments along the way.
Exactly. It's about asking yourself questions like, how am I approaching this material? Is this strategy working for me?
Right.
Do I need to try something different?
Okay.
It's about becoming a more active and engaged participant
Right.
in your own learning.
So we're not just passively absorbing information.
Mm-hmm.
We're actively shaping and directing our own understanding.
You got it.
That's much more empowering.
It is, and it can make a huge difference in your learning outcomes.
Really?
When you're more aware of your own strengths and weaknesses, you can tailor your study strategies accordingly and make more efficient use of your time.
So metacognition is all about self-awareness and self-regulation when it comes to learning.
Exactly.
Like becoming a master of your own mind.
Yes. It's about recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to learning.
Right.
What works for one person might not work for another.
Right. Everyone's different.
The key is to experiment, reflect, and find what works best for you.
It's like finding the perfect recipe for your brain.
Yeah, find what works for you.
You might need to tweak the ingredients and adjust the cooking time to get the desired result.
I love that analogy.
Speaking of recipes, the video also touched on the importance of creating a conducive learning environment.
Ah, yes. Your learning environment can have a huge impact on your focus and productivity.
We talked about the importance of minimizing distractions, but is there more to it than just like silencing our phones and finding a quiet spot?
There is. It's about creating a space that supports your learning goals.
Okay.
It's about optimizing your physical environment, the lighting, the temperature, the ergonomics of your study space.
Okay, so we're not just talking about mental space, we're talking about physical space as well.
Yes, our physical surroundings can have a surprisingly significant impact on our ability to focus.
I never really considered how my physical surroundings might be impacting my ability to focus.
Yeah, it's easy to overlook those things, but they can make a big difference.
So, for example, how does lighting play into it?
Well, if you're trying to study in a dimly lit room, your eyes will have to work harder,
Okay,
which can lead to fatigue and make it harder to concentrate.
that makes sense.
Similarly, if you're sitting in an uncomfortable chair,
Ooh, yeah.
your body will be sending signals of discomfort to your brain,
Right.
which can also distract you from your studies.
It's like trying to run a marathon in flip-flops.
Exactly. You need the right gear to perform at your best.
So what are some like tips for creating an optimal study environment?
Well, first and foremost, make sure you have adequate lighting.
Okay.
Natural light is ideal, but if that's not possible, make sure you have a well-lit study space
Right.
with a desk lamp that provides focused illumination.
So banish the flickering fluorescent lights
Yes, please.
and embrace the warm glow of a good desk lamp.
There you go.
Got it. What else?
Temperature is another important factor.
Okay.
If you're too cold, your body will expend energy trying to warm up,
Yeah.
which can leave you feeling drained and sluggish.
Makes sense.
On the other hand, if you're too hot, you might feel restless and irritable.
Right.
So find a temperature that feels comfortable for you and dress accordingly.
Goldilocks principle applies to studying too.
Yes,
Not too hot, not too cold, just right.
exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these little details can add up
They do.
to a more focused and productive study session. What about the ergonomics of our study space?
Right. So make sure your chair provides adequate back support
Okay.
and adjust your desk height so that your elbows are bent at a 90-degree angle when you're typing.
Got it.
Consider investing in an ergonomic keyboard and mouse
Okay.
if you spend a lot of time on your computer.
Good tips. And don't forget about taking breaks to stretch and move around.
Absolutely. Regular movement is essential
Yeah.
for both our physical and mental well-being.
Yes.
Set a timer to remind yourself to get up and stretch, walk around, or do some light exercises every hour or so.
Yeah, just to get the blood flowing.
It'll help you stay energized, focused, and prevent those aches and pains.
Like hitting the reset button
Exactly.
on your body and mind.
Yeah.
I'm starting to realize that effective studying is not just about memorization memorization techniques
Right.
and mental strategies.
It's more holistic than that.
It's about taking a holistic approach that encompasses our physical environment, our mindset, and even our physical well-being.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about creating a symphony of factors
Ooh, I like that.
that work together to support our learning goals.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we are complex beings and our learning is influenced by a multitude of interconnected elements.
It's a beautiful and empowering perspective. We're not just cogs in a machine, we're the conductors of our own learning orchestra.
Beautifully said.
And with the right tools and techniques, we can create a masterpiece of understanding.
And remember, the journey of learning is a lifelong adventure.
Mhm.
There's always something new to discover a new skill, to master a new perspective, to embrace.
It's a reminder to stay curious, stay engaged, and never stop seeking knowledge.
Well said.
This deep dive has been such an eye-opening
It
experience.
has.
I feel like I've been given a whole new toolkit
Me too.
for approaching learning, and I'm excited to put these strategies into practice.
Me too. Let's do it.
I don't know about you, but I'm feeling very inspired.
I am too.
So on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive on smarter studying. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey of discovery.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining. This is the Practical World Podcast.